Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Able Voices podcast. I'm Dr. Rhoda Bernard, founding managing director of the Berklee Institute for Accessible Arts Education and the assistant chair of the music education department at Berklee College of Music. And I'm proud to present this podcast featuring disabled artists and arts educators. We are inviting artists with disabilities to be guest hosts for the Able Voices podcast. Today's guest host is Ben Lunn. Ben Lunn is a music composer, conductor, musicologist, teacher, and associate artist for Drake Music and Drake Music Scotland. As a composer, Lunn's music reflects the material world around him, connecting his Northeastern heritage or how disability impacts the world around him or his working class upbringing. Alongside this, he has become renowned for his championship of others, which have seen him creating unique collaborations with musicians from across the globe and developing unique concert experiences and opportunities for others. He has won accolades from the Scottish Music Awards in both 2023 and 2020 for his work with Hebrides Ensemble and Drake Music Scotland. In 2022, Ben became the first Northeast composer to be selected for the Royal Philharmonic Society's Composer Scheme, which sees him paired with Music in the Round. As a musicologist, Lunn specializes in Baltic music, Horatiu, Radulescu, political ideology and composition, and composing and disability. He has had the honor of lecturing at some of the world's leading academic institutions, and his articles have been published across Germany, UK, US, Russia, Lithuania, and collected by the Arvo Hat Centre. In 2021, Ben also helped found the Disabled Artists Network, an organization which is bridging the gap between the professional world and disabled artists.
Hello and welcome. I am Ben Lunn and I am a composer originally from the northeast of England, living and working in Scotland, and I am very honoured to be the guest host for the Able Voices podcast. And I am joined by a very good friend of mine, both colleague and just sort of fellow wonderful disabled artist, Nicholas McCarthy. And so without trying to shower too much praises onto him, I want to just show off firstly a lovely piece that we're going to hear of his. So Nicholas, do you want to share a little bit about the piece you're going to share for us today?
Absolutely, and it's great to see you, Ben, and thanks so much for having me on this wonderful podcast. So I think the piece we're going to listen to is one of my own arrangements, actually. I arranged this with a colleague of mine, Arta Simmerer, and this is his arrangement of Rachmaninoff's famous prelude in G minor.
Marvellous. Wasn't that wonderful? Fantastic. So now we've had a little taste of the wonderful playing of Nicholas. I would like to sort of follow up with a nice question. Could you just tell us a little bit about yourself, your journey into music, and what sort of things you get up to now as an artist?
Absolutely. So I had a very late start in my musical journey. I come from a completely normal background. I'm an only child. Both parents just worked normal jobs. They weren't musicians themselves. I went to state school, normal school, and it wasn't until I was 14 that I realised that I wanted to become a concert pianist. And how that happened was I was in my school, and there was a colleague, fellow student of mine, friend of mine, and she was playing a piece by Beethoven, Beethoven's Waldstein Sonata, one of his late sonatas. And she was an amazing, accomplished pianist. And I just had one of those moments then that you kind of read about, or, an Oprah Winfrey kind of interview, where it's kind of these real moment in my life that absolutely changed the course of my life for forever. And I just remember my friend finishing, these last chords of this sonata, and I kind of emerged from it being in this daze of a performance and just decided there and then that I wanted to dedicate my life to playing the piano. And there was obviously a slight issue there because I was born without my right hand. So, being a pianist certainly isn't the first career choice you'd have thought I'd have picked. Definitely wasn't my parents' first choice for me either. But yeah, that's how it began, really. So yeah, that was my entry into the world of music.
So jumping on from that, how did you sort of find that journey into music education at all? Because there isn't, particularly the age we're at, that it's not the same kind of amounts of sort of support for disabled people in the arts education, or sort of alternative models of education and all this other kind of stuff. So how was it sort of trying to get yourself the foot through the door to trying to learn to play the piano?
Yeah, I was very lucky, I suppose, because I had a good music teacher at school, just curriculum music teacher. And when I discovered that I could play the piano, and I started to self-teach and self-learn, she was very encouraging, and it was nice and encouraging. But again, it was all very much basic stuff. Really, there wasn't any provisions for me to go on, and it was very much about deciding for myself, and also for me as an only child from two parents who aren't musicians. That was difficult because, auntie hadn't been to conservatoire, or, great uncle, this wasn't a concert pianist. Do you see what I mean? So it was very foreign for me to kind of want to go into that world. And quite frankly, my parents, nor I, obviously, didn't know what the steps were in order to get me to where I needed to be. Quite frankly, we didn't know what a conservatoire was, let alone, how to apply for one, or when to audition, what the standard is. I just didn't know. So it was very much kind of trialing and kind of learning for the first time, being kind of a trailblazer, I suppose, within that, and trying to fathom it out myself, really. And that's just how it was. And because I wanted to do it, because it was me and it was my choice, I was very determined, and I was very happy to be carving out and finding out those things that I needed to find out.
So yeah, my own journey was very similar in the sense of just didn't come through a traditional route. So it was all trying to make sense of it at the same time as then coming across the various different barriers of being a disabled person trying to navigate higher education and so on. And I know we've talked about it a lot in the past, about your joys of higher education. And so I imagine also the listeners will be very intrigued about it as well, because obviously it's not something that's advertised by any of the music colleges internationally, that they do have left-hand pianist classes and also the kind of stuff. So how did you find that particular element of it, which is where you got the sort of the really strong element of your education?
Yeah. Well, what I did was I kind of reached out to, the heads of department, the head of keyboard at the Royal College of Music, for instance, where I went on to study, to say, I'm coming to audition. How is the repertoire constraints? Left-hand repertoire has 3,000 plus works. As you know, it's a really large volume of works. However, when you're going through conservatoire, you have to play a Mozart sonata, you have to play a large-scale work by Bach, you have to play a late Beethoven sonata, you have to play a large romantic work by Chopin. They don't exist for left-hand alone. So I could offer alternatives. I could say to the heads of department, look, this is what you want from the program. Obviously, those composers didn't write anything for left hand alone, but this composer did, and it's the same length and it's the same difficulty. And would you be open to that? And they were very flexible. The Royal College were fantastic with allowing me to take the lead on the repertoire suggestions, because I was the specialist. Even as a student, it was me. I knew much more about left hand repertoire than my teachers did, for instance. Just because of research. So they were very good and very flexible. like that. And I always said to them, the problem, looking back, I wish I'd kind of spoken to them and said about the marking. I wanted at the time to be very much marked exactly the same as if I had two hands. Looking back, I probably would have built into the mark system a little bit of a leeway or a percentage with the view, because the repertoire I was playing was very, very, very advanced for what I would have played if I had two hands. So, for instance, in a technical exam, in your first year of conservatoire, students were playing, a Mendelssohn etude or something like that. You wouldn't play the big Liszt etudes or big Chopin etudes in your first year. Remember, it's a 4-year degree. Whereas for me, I went in my first year of technical exam, I was playing Chopin-Godowsky studies. Well, they're purported to be the hardest piece of piano music in the world, and I wasn't ready for that either, but I kind of didn't have a choice with it. So in that regard, because, the repertoire was so much difficult beyond my years, really, I feel that I should have kind of brokered or spoke to them about this kind of difference in marking. But at the time, I was very much like, nope, I want to be marked exactly the same as everybody else. Not really factoring that in. So yeah, and again, I have obviously a fantastic relationship with the Royal College of Music still. I'm an honorary member there, so the dialogue's very open. And if they ever had a left-hand pianist come through, I'm sure they would reach out to me to say, can you come in and teach them, or how can we do things differently from when you were a student here all of those many moons ago?
And I think that's the things you detailed, as well as this, just the slight victim of circumstance of the repertoire as well, because as I'll ask you to sort of talk about a bit more in detail. It's one, because there is so much repertoire for the left hand that we kind of forget that it's there, because obviously we always love the massive flashy pieces for both hands flying around the keyboard and all the other kind of stuff, and we forget that not only is there specialized concerti for the left hand, but also all the various different, say, party pieces or arrangements and all these other kinds of things, which then, as you say, put you in this wonderful bind where all of these pieces were built as a virtuoso showing off as well, and it's not just a pianist doing a little concert. So the demands you'd put yourself through were significantly higher, regardless.
Yeah.
And all those kind of other elements as well. So I think, just for the listeners of the podcast, I think they'd love to hear more about the actual repertoire, what exists, who are your heroes within this world, and so on.
Yeah. But it's a fascinating, I mean, obviously I'm biased, I know, but, I'm absolutely fascinated. And as you know, Ben, I'm often whittering on about, left-hand repertoire and the history of it. And I find it truly fascinating. It started really in the 19th century. So back then, concert pianists, they were like rock stars. I always joke and say I'm sadly in the wrong century. But, 19th century concert pianists, they were really up there with, the Adeles and the Lady Gagas. They were as popular as any of our big pop artists are today. And often what they would do to kind of drive the crowds even more wild than they already were, this fandom that was going on. Take Franz Liszt, for example, very well documented fandom around him, and women would faint at the sight of him, and, that kind of thing. So to drive the crowds wild, even further, they would play on irony a little bit. So they would say, you've just watched me play a recital, two-handed recital. Wait till you see what I can do with my weaker hand. And so then they would play with their weaker hand, which for most people in the world, most people are right-handed. So your left hand tends to be your slightly weaker hand. So this little play on irony, they'd play this amazing bravura piece with just their left hand, their weaker hand. And the crowd would go obviously absolutely mad, and they would love them even more. So that's how left-hand repertoire started. And then if we fast forward in time and we get to the First World War, and for the very same reason, most people are right-handed in the world. If you're in a wartime situation, a battle situation, you're very highly statistically to injure or lose or damage your right arm. Much higher statistically over damaging your left arm. And so that happened, as we know, thousands of servicemen were coming back from battle, often with missing limbs, right arm, shoulder, everything. And there was this one particular man, Paul Wittgenstein, part of the wealthy Viennese family, the Wittgensteins, brother of Ludwig Wittgenstein, the philosopher. And his dream was to become a concert pianist. But in those high society kind of families, it was very much forbidden. It was looked down upon to be any performer of any kind. You can't do that. That, being shamed to the family name. But so when Wittgenstein's dad passed away, Paul Wittgenstein went out and did his concert debut as a concert pianist. To rave reviews, he was a very fine pianist. And obviously he had two hands. Fast forward in time, months, under a year, the First World War broke out. He was called into battle. He went into battle, and within a matter of months, he was shot in the right shoulder by a Russian bullet. He was captured as a prisoner of war and transported to Siberia. And here, his right arm was crudely amputated. He was there for a while, but lucky for him, he was repatriated back to Vienna. And it was here that he used his, steely determination, really, but also his family connections, his links, his wealth, his family wealth, to commission the leading composers of the 20th century to write for left hand alone. So he commissioned Ravel, Prokofiev, Benjamin Britten, Richard Strauss, Korngold, you name it, anyone who was an important composer at the time. He was there offering them large sums of money to write left hand alone works for him. And then he redid his debut, but this time as a left hand alone pianist. So it was really amazing that, a concert pianist is, their concert debut is an important moment in a concert pianist's life. And he did too, because he did one debut as a two-handed pianist and then one debut as a left-hand alone pianist. So I have a huge amount of admiration for Paul Wittgenstein. And I always credit him, without him, that I wouldn't have the career that I have today, because I wouldn't have access to these 20th century titans of composition. If Ravel hadn't wrote that concerto for left hand, if Prokofiev hadn't written the fourth concerto for left hand, if Britten hadn't written the diversions for piano and orchestra, that I really wouldn't have the concerto side of things apart from what I commission now. I'd only have that. Whereas because of him, I've got access to 32, 33 plus concertos and counting. Not all thanks to him, obviously people have commissioned, including myself. But there's a large set of concertos, which is great. So, there really is a lifetime's worth of work available for a left-hand alone pianist. And what's interesting, people always say, and I think that people get quite excited to ask me this question, what about right hand? And I always kind of feel I'm letting people down here, but it isn't the case. It's just factually correct. There really isn't much right-hand repertoire at all. It very much is left-hand alone repertoire, and it's written for the left hand for a reason. Obviously the commissioners only had their left hand. The tradition was already there in the 19th century because of that weaker hand, play on irony kind of stuff. But also physiology, the left hand, if you look at your left hand, your thumb is the strongest finger, as we know. And in your left hand, the thumb is at the top. That's going to be playing that melody. That's going to be projecting that melody line out. And your rest of your fingers are going to be accompanying. It makes much more sense than the other way around in right-hand repertoire. So there are some right-hand pieces, but nothing, it would be hard to have a full-time concert career like I have if I was born the other way around. Because, Ravel piano concerto played with, for left hand, played with the right hand. People have done that, and it doesn't really work. It's funny, it doesn't, you can hear it sound-wise, you can hear the technicalities, it really works beautifully for left hand alone.
And I think there's two interesting points that come out of this as well. Is it's what I've always found endlessly fascinating about the left hand repertoire as well, is it's very rarely discussed as a disability art in and of itself, because it's been so widely accepted as well. It's just Ravel's piano concerto. It is a concerto that just for left hand, and it's not really treated as something that only exists to the extent as it does because of the likes of Wittgenstein pushing it forward beyond the party pieces. But then also it's the same time the physiology sort of does help a little bit on that kind of instance. But when we sort of compare it to, say, like the wonderful advances for accessible music technology, with all of these wonderful instruments that have been made for the various musicians that me and you both know, like, say, Rona Smith or Claire Johnson, and all these other kind of figures, because they're using brand new technology, they don't have the repertoire, and therefore they don't have the same kind of respect, which makes it really hard to actually forge a career on that front. So the point you make about the left-hand repertoire is just a really interesting circumstance. One, because it's not really seen as a disabled art in and of itself, because so many non-disabled musicians play at it, because it's so accepted as mainstream repertoire. We've sort of overlooked or forgotten that it's that bit, which then means that, one, there's just this wonderful path that is laid out for you to a certain degree, but also it then means that when we look at, say, other examples where the evolution of accessible music technology suffers this problem because they don't have the repertoire and they don't have the respect, which means that for them to sort of pursue a career with their instruments. So, for example, our dear friend Rona Smith and her digital harp, she's having to work it out as she goes and makes it up as she goes along, because there isn't really something there. But it's in some elements, it's really liberating, because it means she can define what it means to play that instrument, but it means there isn't necessarily a path for others to follow. And there's all these very interesting sort of routes and so on. Whereas the one blessing we have, thanks to Wittgenstein and thanks also to that party piece tradition as well, it's meant that there is a whole body of repertoire, which, once again, we're both very thankful that you have a left hand and not a right one.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I say, I always feel bad when, I get lots of messages and lots of things from people and young children, and, and they've been inspired by me, which is lovely. But they've been born the other way round. And this is part of the reason that I created the first syllabus for one hand through ABRSM, the Associated Board of the Royal Schools of Music here in the UK, and I created that syllabus for one hand, not just left hand, so that people from initial grade up to grade 5, they don't, I wanted them to be able to have that option, because then likewise, what I'm hoping is, if, for instance, we do get a fantastic right hand alone pianist who's commissioned pieces and whatever, we're then expanding another repertoire here. We're creating commissioning opportunities. So that's why I was very much open to, I didn't want to kind of close it off just to left hand repertoire. And yes, I know there's, having only a right hand does have its limitations with regards to a career, but who knows what that will be like in 50 years. If we've had someone come through the ranks who's exceptional, who also commissions new work by the likes of you, Ben, and people like that, we don't know what that's going to be like in 50 years, 10 years, so that's why I didn't want to close it off to anyone.
Exactly. And like you're saying, also with the example from Wittgenstein, is he made it happen because he then went on commissioning, but he just needed something small to start with and then built on from there. And so this work with the ABRSM is hopefully a fantastic start for a future right-handed star, which hopefully we won't have to wait 50 years to see it. But
well, exactly,
you never know how long these things take, do I? So I'd like to sort of focus a little more now directly on yourself and the role you see with yourself sort of engaging with this repertoire, but also in sort of expanding it, because in our sort of previous conversations when we work together, the strange irony with all this lovely repertoire is it sort of stops at like 1950. And it's like, how do you sort of deal with that as an artist, and how have you sort of tried to promote this way of working as an artist as well?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. And also, like what we've spoken about, Ben, when we worked together and you wrote that wonderful concerto for me, History Needs, the concertos that are available, they're kind of 20th century, very much firmly sitting in the 20th century. They're huge orchestrations. They're massive. They're often extended orchestras. So on a practical level, it's very difficult for orchestras to put them on because of cost. It costs a lot of money for them to bring in these extra players or whatever. Versus a Mozart piano concerto is a very small, orchestra that doesn't going to cost them. So that's when I spoke to you about it. When you said you were interested in writing a piece for me, I said, let's do it for strings that we can scale up and keep it also small as well. And it was great because it gives us that flexibility. So yeah, that moving forward, when I work with other composers, I'm going to keep to that model, I think, and try to provide both myself, but again, obviously repertoire to other people, flexibility in the sizes of the orchestra. Because, to put Ravel Piano Concerto on for left hand, it's very expensive, and it's only a 23-minute concerto. I mean, it depends how fast I play it, but, it's a short concerto. So again, practical wise, and often, orchestras have asked me, could I play another concerto in the same program, which I've done many times, Prokofiev's Fourth Concerto and Ravel Piano Concerto for left hand, or Benjamin Britten's Diversions for left hand and orchestra and Ravel Piano Concerto, because then they're getting, there's two short concertos there either side of the interval, and it's quite impactful then. So yeah, it's even on that practical level, I find it quite interesting why there wasn't, these 20th century composers didn't think of that sometimes as well, you know?
Yeah, because there's sort of a part of me sees that when you sort of look at other kinds of repertoire, sometimes pieces like this come about because they've been very specifically commissioned. So sometimes you'll find someone's commissioned a piece to be a partner to it. So this is the most common with, say, like Messiaen's Quartet at the End of Time. The amount of people who have then been commissioned to write for that quartet setup just to be played alongside the quartet for the End of Time, which creates its own sort of problems and sort of associations for the poor composers writing it, but it's helps sort of create a lot of repertoire, whereas a partner for a concerto is also very difficult in that instance. One, because practically it's very hard to do, but it's yeah, there's sort of all those various different kind of connotations. But then also similarly between sort of Paul Wittgenstein and yourself, I don't know if there was necessarily a left-handed champion to be that voice in the middle, whereas the concerti, say like by Hans Abrahamson, which is for the left hand, was written for a pianist with both hands.
Yeah.
And so it's a very different dynamic again. And so I'm very curious of what your thoughts on their particular approach, if you know how much you know that particular piece as well.
Yeah, I must. And you know what my musical tastes are like, Ben. So it isn't, it isn't one that I've learnt, not one that I've played, and not one that I'm, it's not on the top of my list to add to my repertoire. But yeah, I mean, people ask me a lot the question about, how I feel about being a one hand, being born without my right hand and being a one-handed, being the left-handed pianist, but having a lot of two-handed pianists play my repertoire. And I'd be completely lying if I said sometimes it doesn't really pee me off. If there's and I'm thinking, oh my God, like you've got like so many two-handed concertos in your repertoire. And I do have lots of concertos in my repertoire, but, I don't have two hands, so I can't step on their toes, but they can definitely step on mine. So I'd be lying if I didn't say that does happen occasionally. But at the same time, literally half and half in my brain, I love hearing, my favourite pianists who are, who will then play on the odd occasion, play my repertoire, because I love hearing their interpretation of it. I love hearing something new. I love the artistry about it. So it's really funny. I'm literally in polar opposites in my head about how I feel. I think in other realms with regards to and as we know that's been a big topic around race and about how white people playing black characters or black characters playing white characters, and there's big conversations about that. It's quite similar in my instance, but it's very accepted that two-handed pianists will play it. And like I said, I'm very much in two minds. I don't have an answer because, like I said, I'm often very happy to hear their interpretation. I'm often very intrigued, very happy, and then likewise sometimes I'm very cross.
But I think also it sort of ties into the fact that, like what we said earlier, the problem as well with a lot of this repertoire is people forget that it was written for a disabled person, whereas obviously the sort of cultural connotations on race and so on is a different thing because we very definitely know where things lie.
Yeah.
Whereas, say, what example, Scriabin Sonata for the left hand, people sort of forget that he lost action of his right hand through injury, so he just wrote something for himself for his left hand, and people forget
the
that.
Prelude to Nocturne, yeah.
So it's always really very interesting, and so I think what I would quite like as well to sort of as an opportunity to use this podcast to show yourself off as well. Could you sort of talk a bit more about some of the upcoming projects? You've already mentioned a little bit with your work with the ABRSM, but also sort of other concerts, because I know there's a very fancy one which I want you to show off to everyone else. So what do you do in a minute?
Well, it's been lovely, and obviously me and you met during lockdown, didn't we? And so you've obviously seen a real shift in my career as well as I have, and it's lovely. People think because I was, I had albums out and things, and I was in inverted commas deemed a success, in the industry. But people forgot, or I think people assumed that I was playing with orchestras, and I wasn't. I didn't do my professional orchestral debut till 2020. So that kind of puts 2021. So that puts it into context. I think the industry didn't realise that I wasn't being booked to play these concertos that I knew and love and knew I would be able to do very well and to give my interpretation of these. So yeah, and I remember saying to my manager during lockdown, I said, you know what? I said, I think I need to make an exit to make an entrance. And that's what we did. So we went quiet for 2 and a bit years. And luckily I do a lot of public speaking, as you know, for businesses. So, you know, the bailiffs weren't at the door, thankfully, and I'm very in the lucky position with that. So I didn't need to perform, and I didn't perform. And then when the pandemic lifted, and obviously it took ages for everything to get back to normal post-pandemic, especially in our industry, because things were still closed for ages and whatever. But then all of a sudden, my manager was able to say, it was like a clean slate. And it was like people had, you know, remember him. And then all of a sudden I started getting booked by the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra and the BBC, BBC orchestras and all of these people who knew about me and thought I was wonderful and had said, oh yes, you must come and play with us. But it never came to fruition. Whereas then all of a sudden, bam, 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 it started. And then now I'm very excited and very lucky. I feel very honoured to have been asked to perform at the BBC Proms in London this summer, which will be wonderful. And it's, you know, for any listeners who aren't familiar with the BBC Proms, it's the biggest classical music festival in the world. It's 88 concerts that run from July right through to September. In London's iconic Royal Albert Hall, which is a huge venue, you know, 6,500 seats. And my prom is going to be televised and it's streamed live on radio. So, you know, it's a really big, exciting thing. I mean, I'm nervous about it, Ben, I'm not going to lie, but I'm also very excited and I feel very ready. You know, I feel ready to do this. This is a concerto. I'm playing Ravel Piano Concerto for left hand. It's a concerto I've played many times. And what I love particularly about me doing this upcoming prom is the fact that the last time a one-handed pianist played this work was by Paul Wittgenstein himself, who was the commissioner of Ravel's Concerto for Left Hand. And he played it at the proms in 1951. So I'm the second one-handed pianist to play this. And obviously lots of two-handed pianists have played it in between, but I'm the second one-handed pianist to play this since Wittgenstein did in 1951. So for me, as it's a real full circle moment, and I'm really excited about that. I'm really excited.
It's going to be really, really wonderful. And it's also just quite nice that we could also try and market it as a historically informed performance as well, which is always very funny with this kind of repertoire as well.
Absolutely, yeah, I know, exactly.
Yes, and it's going to be utterly wonderful. And I will be glued to my TV when it's happening as well. So you have to remind us the exact date, because I don't know if will it be the same date that it's...
I have a feeling it's going out live. I presented the proms years ago on television, and when I was presenting the prom, it got televised about a week later than the actual concert. Whereas I have a feeling, someone said to me, I think they're going out as live. So I don't know. I will find out, and obviously we can put it in the show notes or whatever with the podcast. So
wonderful. So I'm looking forward to that. And I'm very aware that me and you can just chat away for ages and ages, but we do have to try and keep focus and be helpful to our listeners and give them bits of advice. So I think what would just be quite a nice way to help sort of round off our discussion is, what sort of bits of advice would you give to young disabled artists, either say like with similar disabilities to yourself or just other disabilities broadly, if they're wanting to enter into the music world or go through education in music and so on? What bits of advice would you give them to travel through this?
I would say know your worth, and if you believe that you can do it, absolutely stick to your guns. You know, I was told countless times to, you know, you can't be a concert pianist. You're not going to be a concert pianist. You can't possibly have a career doing it. And I knew, I don't know how I knew, but I knew in my gut that I could. I knew I could have a career as a one-handed concert pianist. And so I'm a big believer in kind of not always listening to the people who know, you know, to absolutely listen to your own gut and your own, because it's only you who's going to go on and do it and achieve. So I would say definitely to you know, and not to believe that anything is possible, like I did, and I still believe that.
Wonderful, and that's a utterly fantastic note. And I think realistically, I can't add anything else beyond that, except for everyone, they should check out Nicholas McCarthy's stuff online. As he said, he's already appearing in the proms this summer, as well as also the wonderful work that he's done with the ABRSM. He has multiple albums, and I'd highly recommend you listen to them. And from myself and from Nicholas, thank you very much for listening, and we will catch you next time. Thank you.
Able Voices is a production of the Berklee Institute for Accessible Arts Education, led by me, Dr. Rhoda Bernard, the founding managing director. It is produced by Daniel Martinez del Campo. The intro music is by Kai Levin, and our closing song is by Sebastian Batista. Kai and Sebastian are students in the arts education programs at the Berklee Institute for Accessible Arts Education. If you would like to learn more about our work, find us online at berkeley.edu/BIAAE or email us at BIAAE@berkeley, that's LEE.edu.